say a couple of things of my own. I graduated from Rapid City High School in 1942, so I was certainly very much aware of the guardsmen in Rapid City and the classmates of mine who were going off to Camp Claiborne and then off to North Africa. My husband was in the Guards, and my brother. I have a soft spot for you right here in my heart. So I want to introduce Dave Super, and then Duke Doering will also be part of this program. Thank you.
Well, there are plenty of alumni here and fact checkers and the like, and so I'm getting even more nervous than I was earlier this morning. And I'm going to do the top level stuff, and we'll stay here for questions and answers until the beer runs out. So that, you know, being a guard deal here, this could go on until about 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. So, anyway, before I begin with our formal presentation about the National Guard here in Sturgis, part of what I'm going to talk about is the National Guard family. And the National Guard family in Sturgis in the last few weeks, and now most recently in the last couple of days, has had a tragedy within it, with the death of a young boy here in the community, and a couple of weeks ago his grandfather. And so in the spirit of paying tribute to the Forbes family and all of what they're going through at the moment, and all the rest of the National Guard family that's in and around Sturgis, Meade County, here in the Black Hills, let's just pause for a moment of silence here and pay tribute to everyone. Amen. Okay, well, the National Guard in Sturgis. It's me. It's probably about half of the people in this room as official signed up members, and then when you count the family members with spouses and others that are part of the deal, it's really everybody in this room. And that's certainly not by accident. And when you say the National Guard of Sturgis, you could say the National Guard of Lamar's, Iowa, or Bug Tussle, Alabama, or Sturgis, Kentucky, or Sturgis, Michigan, or there's, I think, a Sturgis, Mississippi. The National Guard really is everywhere in the United States, and it's been that way since way before the founding of the nation. So this year is the 380-something birthday of the founding of the National Guard in Boston, 1636. And so our roots go deep in this community, in this state, and in the nation. And so today we're going to talk about how the roots fit into the key city of the Black Hills and fit into Sturgis. With so many guardsmen that are here in the room with us today too, it also, for anyone who might be a newcomer to town, and you just look around the room and you can see just how much the National Guard has been a fabric of this community, whether in uniform, at the armory, during an emergency or something like that, or just day to day. When you see somebody go down the street and say, oh, there's Linda, oh, she's in the Guard. There's Bill, oh, Bill's in the Guard. And that's just that acknowledgement, that awareness that threads the National Guard through the fabric of the community. Things started here officially in 1930. And in the 1930s, the state of South Dakota still had an entire engineer regiment. So there was a regimental headquarters of the 109th Engineer Regiment, and then its 10 line companies that were scattered across the state, everywhere but Sturgis. Sturgis didn't have a National Guard unit until 1930, and we historians have been digging at that, and we kind of speculate around the edges, why not, whatever. And I think you can't overlook the influence of the military presence of the active duty Army at Fort Meade. And so when it's time to spend money and political influence and make assignments of units in various communities and the like, when Sturgis would come down the line, it would be, oh, well, they've got the Army. So we'll put the guard unit in Lee, or Deadwood, or Spearfish, or Belfouche, or Phillip, or Lemon, or Edgemont, the different places across the state. And so that's some of how the explanation goes for why it took really so long for a formal National Guard unit to be created in Sturgis. So in March of 1930 is when Company F of the 109th Engineer Regiment is put into action, starts it's its birthday for the community. And with that Company F, which had been in Deadwood, and Deadwood was in a struggle at the time to maintain membership sufficient to keep the company alive, so they moved it down to Sturgis. Well, with that came William Brown. And so when Bill Brown comes to town as a new lieutenant in the unit, his leadership, his commitment to Sturgis and the National Guard and all that, you just can't talk about the National Guard in the early days without first mentioning the influence of Colonel Brown, Mr. Brown, depending on how all of us here in this room got to know him. And I like to say that unless if you had a heartbeat and a pulse, well, if you had a heartbeat, you have a pulse, and whatever, and you were a boy in high school in Sturgis, somehow or another this happened, and you were introduced to the opportunities that were available in the National Guard. And when you put Mr. Brown at the head of the formation, and people like Mel Hendrickson and Vern Doyle and General Meckling and others who were either faculty members, school board members, parents, some way or another involved here in the community, up through the mid-1970s for boys in Sturgis. The opportunity to join the National Guard was certainly made available to you. And I'm one of those fellows that raised his hand and said, yep, I'll take that, please. And Mr. Doering was then the administrator of the unit and made it really, really easy. It probably wasn't for him because he recruited, he did the paperwork for hundreds of us who joined the Guard here in Sturgis. And all of a sudden, one day I wasn't a guardsman, and the next day I was. And I instantly had this group of brothers that I didn't have at home because I had two sisters in my family, and a way to fit in as a 19-year-old into the fabric of the community that wouldn't have happened maybe ever, or it would have taken me a very, very long time to all of a sudden be in the pool with the rest of the Guard unit. So the Guard unit chugs along. In the 1930s, the armory gets built and dedicated in 1937, becomes the cornerstone for the National Guard and other things here in the community. And a year ago when I made the presentation about the armory, some of you who were in the room heard about how the influence of the armory as a structure and as a capability here in the community and the National Guard just fits so perfectly together, as it does elsewhere across the nation. About 3,000 National Guard armories nationwide. So you could deliver this presentation just about anywhere in the country and find similar sentiments. It was the Depression when the unit was here, so the National Guard was a little paycheck for the men who joined. It was the camaraderie. It was an opportunity to serve your country and your state, all of those things. And these are really kind of some of the charter members of the unit, and the pictures are hard to see and the typeface is perhaps hard to read, but if you come up close or you want to look at this later, you can see lots of old pioneer names, pioneer family names here in the community of people who were, of young men who were part of the National Guard in the early 1930s, and what all that meant. When the Guard unit first started here, they met in rented space in what then had been the second story above where Bob Davis's gift shop is now. And the National Guard operated from rented space all across the state for decades. And then dollar by dollar, federal program by federal program, with state matching money, with school matching money, city matching money, armories got built across the state, so that the Guard moved out of these rented meeting halls, lodge facilities, and whatever, into their own communities, or into their own structure. And of course, that goes on today, and increasingly the school National Guard participation is diminishing. And the National Guard owns their armory facilities exclusively for their own use in communities. They're still available for public rent and use and the like, but the Guard, for security reasons and other kind of practicalities of modern day life and the modern day military, the Guard pretty much has to live in their own house and not share it with someone else, particularly students. It gets to be too cumbersome, too complicated to manage. When the National Guard moved into the armory here in the late 1930s, you could drive a Jeep out onto the drill floor and do some training with it or whatever in bad weather. Today, a Bradley fighting vehicle or an armored vehicle, and if there's any contemporary Guardsmen here, they weigh tons and tons and tons. And so National Guard facilities have to be built with reinforced concrete floors that are at the ground level, so that when a 30-tonner rolls in, it doesn't go crashing into the basement. And likewise for security of equipment and all of that, the buildings have to be different from what they were a long time ago. Some of the other early leaders in the Guard, you've already, and you know about the influence of William Brown, Freeman Steele, Vernon Officer, and others who, by the time World War II starts, when the young men are populating the National Guard, and then as they stayed in the Guard after the war, into the 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s, again, more prominent names in Sturgis, community leaders, and the like were all part of the fabric of the early Guard unit here. National Guard training in those days, and really up into the early 1960s, was Monday night. And I don't know if it was Monday night nationwide, but it certainly was here. If Wednesday night was church night, National Guard night was Monday night, and that's just the way that it worked. And so it was typically a 4-hour plus or minus training opportunity on a Monday evening. And over time, that just became less and less practical as a way to provide really meaningful training opportunities to the Guard units. Guard units in the 50s, when I started as a teenager, started to pay attention to the National Guard. You know, if you were a Monday night Guardsman, there were plenty of inspections. Your boots looked really good. You could march around the drill floor as good or as well as any Army unit in America, because that's what you could do in a couple of hours on a Monday night. Maybe they would show a training film, have a lecture, and it's time to go home or across the street to the joint and finish up the training period. And so when the weekend training period came along finally in the 1960s, in the early to mid 1960s, all of a sudden the Guard had a full Saturday and Sunday to train. And so that meant that the cooks could prepare an honest meal, and not just one meal, but several meals. Maintenance could be performed on equipment, and there were fewer and fewer inspections and shiny boots and all of that, and more realistic training and effort put forth with equipment and other kinds of activity. And in a town like this, where there's always been an engineer unit, that could mean all of that parallel support to the civilian community as well. And so the National Guard, well, we're going to use a truck, one of the National Guard trucks, to move the Boy Scouts from here to there, or we're going to use a road grader or a bulldozer or something to do improvements on a city park or some other kind of facility. And the weekend training periods made that a lot more practical. It didn't go over well with everybody. There were lots of old-time Guardsmen that wanted to stick with Monday night, that it worked for us, you know, why do we have to change? There was big pushback from Home State Line, where there was lots of Guardsmen in the Lead Deadwood area, and in those days the mine was a six-day-a-week job, and so if you had to take Saturday off for Guard training, well, you lost a day's pay, or you know, caused a hassle for you at work finally the mine went to a 5-day week, and that took that out of the equation. But early on, that was some more of the resistance of Saturday's a working day, not a National Guard day. And now the weekend training period is just part of the fabric of the National Guard all across the country. And I think frequently a weekend isn't enough. And so there are 3-day training periods, or 4 days, or whatever you have to do in order to make it all work and accomplish the missions. Again, this is some more what the Guard looked like in the 1930s with World War II or World War I, and hand-me-down uniforms, equipment, stuff that didn't work, or certainly didn't work as well as you would expect, and just part of the challenge of being in the National Guard during that era. The National Guard, politicians as powerful and eminent as Winston Churchill and many others talk about National Guardsmen being twice the citizen. That when you join the National Guard, you take 2 oaths. You swear one oath to the nation to defend and protect, and you also swear an oath to the state to do essentially the same thing, to be the state's organized, trained, and equipped military force to assist local authorities. And here's a very, very abbreviated list of things that the Sturgis National Guard unit has been involved in the years since the 1930s, with providing direct and significant assistance to state and local authorities. The Blizzard of '49, the Great Tilford Fire of '50, the Deadwood Fire of '59, of course the Black Hills Flood, Wounded Knee, and all of the difficulty that brought the state right after the flood in 1973 and following on. And then countless smaller missions where it's 1 soldier or 2 or 3, maybe for a day, 2 days, a week, whatever the needs were, why the National Guard pitched in and used their equipment, their manpower, and their training to assist local authorities. And that still goes on very, very much today. Right? There isn't a significant natural emergency somewhere in the nation when you hear on the national news in the first 3 sentences of the story, the National Guard is here, or the National Guard's been called. We're waiting for the Guard to, we can hear the helicopters or whatever. That again is just part of the fabric of the way we live our lives here in Sturgis, in the Black Hills, and throughout the nation. The other part of the fabric of the National Guard for the community is that it also provides a little bit of spit and polish, and there's no one more polished than Sergeant Major Caldwell, who's in the center of the picture here. If I can make this little, this gentleman right here, and your buddies, who were part of what must have been a parade or some event in town where the Guard would have been turned out with equipment on the front lawn and probably marched in a parade that day down Main Street and the like. And you can read in the caption there the names of the people, and you see the prominent names of folks in Sturgis who influenced our lives as teachers or something else here in the community, the contributions that they made. You can also see the equipment that they had, which was, this was full up in the era when it was hand-me-down stuff from the active Army. And that still exists, but the circumstances are different, and the look and feel of the equipment is I would hope by now, a little more modernized and up to speed with the contemporary needs of what the military has to do. And again, we all remember the flood, the influence of what that meant in the community. I was here that night, along with lots of other guardsmen, sent from Rapid City, where I belonged to a guard unit by then. I had transferred to a guard unit in Rapid City, and a company of guardsmen from the Brookings area were being sent to Sturgis to assist, because it looked like early in the evening that the emergency would be as great here or greater than it turned out to be in Rapid City. And so the call went out that we need more manpower here in Sturgis. And so Mason Wheeler and his company was chosen to come here to Sturgis to help. And Captain Wheeler said, yeah, I can find Sturgis, but I don't really know anybody, or whatever. And I was in the basement of the state headquarters building, and it was kind of pick me. And General Meckling and some others said, well, yeah, here's a Sturgis kid, just send him along. And so that's how I got to Sturgis the night of the flood. And all of us have our flood stories to tell. And the impact of what that meant, that event meant on our lives and for the National Guard. And it was serious business all of a sudden. And it was way more than just a blizzard or picking up after a tornado where the threat is gone. All of a sudden that whole night was a threat-filled, never-ending chain of activity for Guardsmen and the citizens, of course, who were here. I want to talk a little bit too about the impact of leadership. It can be very abstract, it's hard to talk about, it's hard to teach. I think in some respects you either can do it or you can't, and it's always been a struggle for me to try to be an effective leader in my family, in my business, in my guard unit. Never easy, never graceful. I could never match Bob Daney's swagger or whatever. We're just going to get it done. You know, I just, if I would say that, they'd say, no, we're not going to get it done. Because you don't know what you're doing. You know? But Bob Daney and many others have this, I think, this kind of inborn natural ability to lead, and I've always admired that in the Guardsmen that I have followed willingly. And it always feels awkward and filled with gloom when it's a leader that doesn't have that natural ability and whatever. Oh, this is going to be hard because this leader doesn't know what he or she is doing and the like. But Sturgis has been the wellspring for some significant leadership in the National Guard. And I think you don't have to turn much farther than the high school class of 1966 with Mike Gorman, became the Adjutant General, my neighbor in Rapid City, Charlie Gray, who ended up being the senior financial officer for the National Guard at Camp Rapid before he retired. And on the left, Ray Carpenter, who ended up being the director of the Army National Guard for 30 months in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know inside baseball, inside the National Guard, General Carpenter's role that he played at the national level is important. And it's one of those things that, along with other distinguished leaders that have come from Sturgis, is I think one of the high water marks anyway of leadership at the national level, not necessarily taking troops into the field to battle the enemy or to battle a flood, but in taking the 600,000 people, well, there wasn't 600,000, but the hundreds of thousands of National Guardsmen and going to Congress and going to the active army to struggle in the meeting room where a different kind of leadership had to be used and demonstrated to fight for the National Guard's place in the sun, as it were. And General Carpenter is the guy who did that for almost 3 years. And my hat's off to him, and there'll be others. His class of '66 was just the unusual one in the school, I think, that sparked these many, many leaders. And then the other gentlemen that you see here in these pictures, including General Meckling, Sergeant Major Caldwell in an earlier picture. I'm going to forget somebody and embarrass myself. But here you see just this, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of the leadership that is learned and practiced in the National Guard and then splashes over into the community, whether it's in City Hall, as the mayor of the community, or on the school board, leadership in a church or other religious organization, in families and in business. all of those skills that you are exposed to and practice and get reinforcement for in the National Guard plays out then in the community as well, and makes us all richer for that experience to have those people, these men and now men and women who are in the National Guard here, being able to contribute back to the community in ways that are, in many instances, priceless with what they do. You heard me talk earlier about the dual mission that the National Guard has, the two oaths that we swear when we join, that of the federal responsibilities that we have, and then of the state responsibilities. The federal responsibilities have been part of the National Guard's role since colonial times. The militia that we talk about in history books, and that when the need was evident, whether it's to fight the British in the Revolutionary War or in the War of 1812, French and Indian Wars, going back before in early colonial times when there were external threats that challenged the colonies, why it was the militia, the local, 300 years ago, the equivalent of the National Guard that took up arms, that were trained, organized, knew each other, had some kind of a chain of command so that they could effectively get stuff done and not be just a mob with guns or pitchforks and torches, but rather an organized group of people who could repel an enemy or a threat that came to the country. Well, so it's been with the National Guard here in Sturgis, with the activations that we see listed here on the board, starting with World War II, when the entire National Guard of the nation was called up. In 1940, the threat in Europe and rising with Japan, those threats were big enough that President Roosevelt and others at the federal level said, we got to get ready for something. They didn't know precisely what, but, well, we better call up the National Guard. And so 250,000 men were called to active duty. They didn't all fall in on one day. It took several months to bring the units onto active duty, starting in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, certainly. The units were called to duty. So that included Company F Troop here in Sturgis, gets called up with the entire engineer regiment. And then you can see on the slide the subsequent call-ups for the Korean War, the Gulf War in 2003, and then several consecutive activations of guard members, from men and now women, from Sturgis units that have gone on active duty. And at the rate that the world is unfolding these days and the like, the activations of guard units from South Dakota and elsewhere, we don't know where that will end. And it's become, it's not routine, but it's not unexpected anymore. And it's one of those goals, those very serious goals that guardsmen train for these days, and they're equipped to do this. To take the story further into World War II, we have retired Warrant Officer Duke Doering, Mr. Doering. For those of you who don't speak inside the National Guard, warrant officers have earned and are entitled to the title of Mr. or Ms., as is appropriate, and I always, when I meet a new warrant officer, I always have to ask myself, all warrant officers are the smartest people in the room. But of course, those of you that have had teacher education or teacher training, and like we all know that there's a bell curve as well. And so, if you have this room full of the smartest people in the world of warrant officers, then where does that warrant officer fit? And where does that? Well, this warrant officer is way, way far on the high end of the bell curve of the guy.
That's a guy too far. You're gonna punch some buttons.
I will, yeah. I can do. I'm trained to do that, and so. But Mr. Doering is going to talk about the activations, and particularly of World War II and some of the events, the watershed events that happened to Guardsmen from Sturgis during that time.
David mentioned that Company F was called a full year before World War II started for the United States. It was going on, of course, for the British and France, but we didn't join until December 7th, 1941, but we had all our troops were activated. All of them had been on active duty for a year. And they were down at the 109th was down at Camp Claiborne for their training. And they were one of the first units that went overseas and made contact with the Germans. They landed in North Africa, the Sturgis boys, in North Africa on the 8th of November, 1942. They went across Tunisia with the British and met with the Germans on the 14th of February, 1943, at a place called Kasserine Pass. It so happened that the Sturgis boys were closer to the Germans than anybody else at that time. The Sturgis was the 109. And so consequently, things were a little rough for them. On the 16th of February, everything was overrun. The 34th Division, who we were connected with, was overrun. And so the word came on the 16th to withdraw and take a night march and go 12 miles to a road that was controlled by the Americans, or was supposed to be controlled by the Americans. The Americans weren't there when they finally got there. But anyway, to get ready for that night move, without vehicles and without lights, just marching randomly through this 12 miles of German troops, they got ready to go, and there was a firefight with the Germans, and the guy by the name of William Weimer, who was from Sturgis, got shot in the buttocks a couple of times. And when they were getting ready to go, the leader, Royal Lee, he was the platoon leader, he said, "You got to take Weimer over to the headquarters of the medical tent and leave him there to get fixed." Well, the troops from Sturgis said, "Now wait a minute, you taught us all this past year that we never leave a comrade behind. So we want to take him with us." So Royal Lee said, finally, I acquiesced, and they got a stretcher and we took off. 4 guys carried him, and they were carrying William Weimer on the night of the 16th, and they'd switch off. And by early morning on the 17th, they were completely exhausted. And so a guy by the name of Bill Caton said, "Why don't you guys just keep going, and I'll stay here with Weimer, and the Germans will catch up with us, but at least you guys can get away." So they did that, and they got away, and they got down about to the 12 miles they were supposed to go, and right there was all the Germans, so they were done, and so they were captured. And at that night, there was 12 of the 109th guys captured on February 17th. The leader was Royal Lee, and he lived a long time. I talked to Royal Lee in 2004 and asked him about that night march and those prisoners, and Royal told me, he said, he was still quite coherent, lived in Montevideo, Minnesota, and he told me the story of William Weimer, and he said, that decision I made that night to take William Weimer down over to the medical tent was the right decision, and that's haunted me for 65 years. It was a decision that I wish I'd have never made, and so he still remembered that. Anyway, we had 12 prisoners there. Bev's father, Thomas Bowman, was one of those. He was from Iowa at the time, but he was one of those prisoners. So So we had 12 of them there, and then we had 2 other prisoners that were caught earlier. One of them was Richard Griffin, and the other one was Swede Anderson. Now, Swede Anderson got captured on December 1st, 1942. The 109th had got to North Africa, to Tunisia. You gotta remember that. And then the British came by and said, we need some volunteers to be in the British Commandos. So what cowboys would go? You know, Swede Anderson and Jerry Gorman and Richard Griffin and a few others. And so they went with the British Commandos. Well, the British Commandos are going to try to take this airfield at Bizerte, Tunisia. And so they go in there to take the airfield, and the Germans are ready for them, and they capture them. So Swede Anderson and Richard Griffin are captured right away. And so Swede then gets, he can improvise a little bit. He escaped a couple of times from the Germans, but they finally got him for good. Now listen to this. I don't know what you think of Swede Anderson, though you know him, but you've got to have some respect for this guy. The Germans, the Red Cross would send packages about every 3 weeks. It'd be about an 8-pound box, and there'd be some foodstuffs and some toilet paper and some shaving things and some of the necessities, and cigarettes. And anyway, about every 3 weeks they'd have them. Well, the Germans didn't have enough support, so they called Swede in, and they talked to Swede, and they said, we want you to drive the Red Cross truck. And, but you've got to promise that you won't escape. So Swede promised. And so every 3 weeks or so, when the Red Cross packages came to the train station, they would send Swede down, and he'd take the truck down, pick up the packages, and come back into the prison and deliver the goods. Well, after D-Day, Swede went down on one trip, and he's down there at the station, and the Germans are retreating, and the Americans are coming through, and so Swede's at the train, and he's in America again. He's in American territory. So he's free, and so he loads up his truck, and you can imagine this, and there's a madman running Germany at the time. Hitler's still there, and he might do anything. He might do away with those prisoners in the prisoner camp. And so Swede, he's free. He doesn't have to worry about that. Well, what's he do? He loads up his truck, drives back through the gate, and delivers the packages to the prisoners. And somebody asked him, why did you do that? I mean, you could have died. And he said, well, I promised them that I wouldn't escape. And of course, that wasn't the reason. The reason was that he didn't want to let down his fellow prisoners. On the other side, when there was the 12 prisoners that were taken at Kasserine Pass, they went for 2 years in Germany, and they were treated fairly well with the Red Cross packages and everything. They came out pretty good. And they lost a lot of weight, though. And Kenneth Gorley, who was one of the prisoners, told me that they weren't fed very well because the Germans didn't have much food themselves. So they would go to the fields and pick up the potatoes and carrots and stuff, and they'd peel them and give the prisoners the peel to make soup. And that's outside of the Red Cross packages. The soups that they made from the peelings was all they had. Well, during World War II, then, there was 2,200 National Guardsmen from South Dakota activated. 31 of those 2,200 became prisoners of war. 2 of them in Japanese prison camps, 29 of them in German prison camps. A miracle of all things, they were there 2 years and more. All 31 of them survived, including William Wyman, and they all came back to the United States. Kind of a miracle. A thing that was kind of surprising to me when I did this research in 2004, of those 12 people that were taken at Kasserine Pass, those 12 prisoners from Sturgis that were taken, 8 of them were still alive. That was 66%. That was 60 years plus after. But the rest of the unit, the other 100 people, only 4 of them were still alive. That was 4%. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but for some reason, those prisoners, their 66% survival rate was a heck of a lot better than 4%. And why that was, I have no idea.
Well, stand by a second here. You see some more World War II slides. This is the leadership of the 109th Battalion and of what was then C Company here, which was the Sturgis unit. And in the regiment, there had to be some. The leadership got juggled around so that there wasn't necessarily a hometown leader leading the hometown troops. They had to break some of those brotherhood bonds at least a little bit just to get work done. And Captain Brown at the time got sent to battalion headquarters, and he had a different staff job at the battalion headquarters. Several of these gentlemen here are from the Brookings area, so they ended up being the leadership for Company C. Here's just a couple of other of these kind of fuzzy pictures from World War II, but just to show a little bit of what the unit did as they fought in North Africa, went across the Mediterranean, and started working their way up the boot of Italy through to the end of the war. They were riding motorcycles then, and just like guardsmen today are still riding bikes. The 3 fellows on the left with posing with the pick and shovel and all of that, the guardsmen are still in training, I think. There's Gorman and Wagner and one other person. That was just, that was part of the souvenirs of the war, to take these kinds of pictures. And we've all seen hundreds and thousands of those kinds of pictures. When the Sturgis unit got called up for World War II, and the entire regiment went to Louisiana first for the maneuvers, they became a very kind of legendary event in and of themselves. It was not just a war game at Camp Claiborne, but it was this big multi-service complex war game that went across several state borders, and it was kind of a free play exercise that tested the command and control capabilities of the guardsmen and the active army troops that had to fit together and become a cohesive team to go on and win the war. There couldn't be these skins in the shirts kind of competition. Everybody had to fit together, and the Louisiana maneuvers were part of that crucible that melted the forces together into one cohesive unit. And from Louisiana, from the training there, the Sturgis troops went to New Jersey. They got on board a ship, the long ocean transit to Great Britain, training there, then eventually North Africa, fighting their way across North Africa, up the boot of Italy, and then finally the war ends and the soldiers come home. Here's more of the Sturgis group, including Joe Ager, who retired as a sergeant major of the battalion here, was mayor of the city, and a prominent businessman. Then we get, the troops are barely home and the Korean War starts. The unit's called to active duty again. Mr. Bachmeyer among them. He's a veteran of that activation, in the center of the picture, and others here. Some of the World War II leadership was still part of the unit, but there are a lot of young guys there in that picture of people that would have been teenagers, just very young men who got called to active duty. General Meckling was among them, and others who got assigned to, they went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for training, and then went to Europe and operated a bridge across the Rhine River for an entire year. And that was challenging engineer duty. I don't have the specifics in my head, but the Rhine River is one of the fastest flowing large rivers in the world. It's not the Mississippi. The Rhine River moves, and it's big. And so to put a military bridge across that river and keep it there, and keep it in operation day after week after week after month, is no small task. And the troops from Company C had an important role in keeping the bridge going. And it wasn't without peril. A Hot Springs National Guardsman was killed working on the bridge one day when a cable snapped, knocked him into the water, and he was gone. And it took quite some time to find him downriver. But that's a picture of what the daily life was like in keeping that bridge set up. And when river traffic had to go, the bridge got separated, and halves of the bridges were pulled with big cables to the shoreline. And then when it was time for trucks and cars and pedestrians, whatever, to go across the river, the two sections of the bridge were brought together again, fastened in the middle, and it became a bridge, a complete bridge across the river. And the Sturgis National Guard unit also had a woman in its ranks in those days, with Sister. And I didn't know much about Sister until very recently, but she was this stray dog that found a home with Company C when they were in North Carolina. And so, American military units are famous for this, of adopting mascots of all men, usually dogs, but that's been going on forever. And the Sturgis unit was not alone. And so Sister found them, or they found Sister, and she became part of the unit. And when it came time for the unit to deploy from Fort Bragg to Europe, they smuggled her aboard the transport ship, and it didn't take long for her to get discovered. And the captain of the ship, the naval vessel, said, no dogs allowed. She's got to go ashore. And so, with reluctance, they took her ashore. Well, out far enough so the captain couldn't see, and the dog came back on board. And when they were underway, then her presence was revealed a second time, and the skipper said, she's going overboard. I mean, it's just, we can't have a dog on the ship. And she stowed away then with the assistance of the Sturgis Guardsmen, and I'm sure others, who said, it's Tuesday, it's your turn to take care of her. And so, for 10 days probably to make the transit, you were at sea for long enough. And and then was part of the unit in Germany and came back. So, and there are lots of mascot stories about that too, of largely these dogs that go and then come home, and they get promoted, and they earn medals, and there's all kinds of things that happen with mascots. We have just one picture for today, and we're running short on time, of a present day activation. In this instance, it was the headquarters of the 109th Engineer Battalion that went to the Iraq War very early in the fight, with the lead elements pushing Captain Johnson, or Lieutenant Colonel Johnson rather, the battalion commander, and his staff pushing hard to keep pace with the lead elements of the U.S. military forces that were there at the start of the war. And this picture is symbolic in a way, in that it's a mixture of South Dakota Army National Guardsmen from the 109th Battalion here in Sturgis, and their parallel unit of the South Dakota Air National Guard, also engineers, construction workers, builders, stationed in Sioux Falls, were in Iraq at the same time. And so there was time enough to get together for a kind of class photo. thousands of miles, on the other side of the world, guardsmen serving together. Okay, now back to school here again for just a minute. In the time that I and many others of us here in the room have been part of the National Guard, we were there during kind of, I don't want to call it the heyday, but the maximum amount of kind of hand-me-down, second string attitudes and whatever for between the National Guard and the active Army. And we were the B team. So the B team got the old helmets and got the old shoes and the old this and that because you weren't the varsity. And that went on for a long time, and really from the end of World War II through the Korean War, in through the 50s, the Cold War period of the 50s, and then during the Vietnam era, certainly, where this second string B squad kind of attitude, and it was more than just an attitude, it was a matter of official Department of Defense policy that the active forces got the resources, particularly during the Vietnam War. They were at the front, they were fighting the war, and the National Guard got the leftovers, got the older equipment, the equipment that needed to be repaired. The budgets for training and other support things were significantly less than their active duty counterparts. Well, as the Vietnam War ended and policymakers in Washington, D.C., politicians and citizens realized that, maybe we didn't do this right. And setting aside whether that war was appropriate or not, just the way that it was executed, with using almost exclusively active duty forces and draftees, and leaving the National Guard and Reserve at home, with some exceptions, was that the smartest thing we could have done? Well, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, who'd been a congressman, and others said, no, we squandered this. We squandered resources, money, manpower, and the spirit and the support of the nation by having this varsity team, B squad kind of policy and attitude of doing things. So they created this total force idea that the National Guard and Reserve and the active duty forces would be as closely as possible fit together with money, training, standards that you had to meet for education and other experiences. So in the event of another emergency, Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm comes to mind, the National Guard is, you better have your game jersey on because you're going to get called sooner, parallel with the active forces. And if the fight goes on longer than we hope, you're going to be called again, and maybe another time, and another time. My little unit, the 129th Public Affairs Detachment in Rapid City, since Bosnia, has been called to active duty 4 times. And that's a dozen people, and not even their own flag, just a little pennant, that they get to go with. But that's an example of how the reach and how the total force policy comes into play. And those of you that have lived here in Sturgis, lived in the Black Hills, and watched the National Guard evolve, certainly through the decade of the 80s and into the early 90s, saw that with the unit. You didn't just go to camp or to Custer Park for National Guard camp. You went to Panama, you went to Korea, you went to Germany, and that wasn't easy to saddle up and go that far and squeeze all that into a 2-week period, not get anybody hurt, and take all your equipment there and bring it all home and not lose it or break it or something like that. And so those were the kinds of challenges that the Guard started learning about in the late 70s and early 80s. And so that by the 90s, that's just, oh, well, where are we going to camp? Can't we go to Custer Park just once? And no, we're going to Korea this time. Next year we're going to go here and there. and whatever. So guardsmen and women here in Sturgis and elsewhere are much more part of the total force. They're part of the worldwide capability of the U.S. military than ever before, and I don't see that ever stopping. I think that's a mechanism that is it's a smart use of tax dollars and of the manpower. It shares the responsibility. It involves the community. When the 842nd gets called up and sent to Iraq or Afghanistan, people in Sturgis have a different kind of investment in what our nation is doing militarily than just, oh yeah, the Army's over there. No, it's my cousin, it's my teacher, my spouse, my brother, or sister, some way or another that's involved. And so that puts a whole different spin on things. Maybe not all that different from what happened in World War II, when 100% of the Guard got called up and was gone, not just for a year at Camp Claiborne, but they got called up in 1941 and didn't come home until 1945. So that's where things will go. Today, in Sturgis, there's the 881st Troop Command. That's the senior unit that's here in town, the big flag, and they supervise command and control for 11 units and detachments. Most of them are in Rapid City these days. The 196th Regional Training Institute, which we didn't talk about much, but that's really Fort Meade. That's the Officer Candidate School, NCO training, other leadership skills that guardsmen and reservists practice and learn, perfect out at Fort Meade. And there's the full-time staff there, plus all the weekend support that it takes to run the Regional Training Institute. And I think that's a real feather in the cap of the National Guard, to capitalize on using the real estate out at Fort Meade and all that goes along with that, to just keep the bonds of the whole mechanism tightly together with the community. And then there's still an engineer unit here in town as well. And I think there will be diesel fuel and shovels in this town forever. There just has to be some little thread of an engineer unit or a really big engineer unit in Sturgis. They have to go together. You can't.
Center of the nation.
Yeah, you can't take the artillery out of here, and you can't take the engineers out of Sturgis. That's the way that it works. And so, in my mind, anyway. And so there's still a detachment of the 842nd Engineer Company, the OMS shop that's out on the west side of town, the garage where the maintenance work gets done, and some of the equipment is stored for the unit. Time for questions or war stories, because we've got to, like I say, the beer won't run out until 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. So. And Private Major Bill Daney is in charge of that concession. And we can tell Bill Daney stories, or other Daney family member stories here, because the footprint of that gang, that family in the National Guard it's another type it's a whole book that you could do about that. Mr. Sigmund.
Yeah, in that first photo you showed, I was amazed how many sons followed their fathers.
Wow.
Ah, yes. And brothers.
Quite a few.
And yes. And that's part of the strength of the Guard, that legacy of handing it off. It's your turn. It's your turn to serve. Here's what it did for me. You can see by example. And now your opportunity comes along.
When I was in Korea, there's California National Guard was assigned to us. All I can remember is one sergeant, and he would go off by himself and do whatever he did and come back and report. I didn't know they worked individually like that, but he would do this.
And that ranges from those bonds of keeping Weimer in the unit, with a hole in his butt, and the sacrifices that those men made to keep their wounded comrade with them. Something that dramatic and that tight is an example. And you can find other Guard units that adopt a dog, and that's a thread. My son was an active duty Army
I don't think you can get out
person.
there.
No, you can't.
And when he was
It's a
in
fenced
Iraq,
in area.
it's just a coincidence, he was with the Hawaii National Guard. And he said they had the best coffee mess in the theater because the Hawaiians made sure that their little care packages, there's macadamia nuts and coffee. And it was the Guard. It wasn't some active duty unit that did that. It was that spirit of the Guard of taking care of them, and the hometown making sure that their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters, the basketball coach, whoever that was in that unit that was in Iraq for a year, had plenty of really good coffee. And so, other questions, reminiscent? Yes, sir. This is General Holliday, for those of you who may not know who this gentleman is.
First of all, I'd like to compliment Dave and Duke on their presentation. It was great. When you were talking about the mobilization during Vietnam, it was a sad situation. We had a unit down in Winter, South Dakota. It was a medical clearing company, commanded by a fellow you probably know around here in Sturgis by the name of Doc Hayes. He volunteered that unit for active duty during the Vietnam War. Rejected by Department of Defense. And then he says, well, heck, I'd like to go. No, we don't want any Lieutenant Colonel National Guard people over there in Vietnam. So then he went to the Public Health Service and volunteered again and went to Vietnam and spent 2 years over there. I tell that story because we did have a lot of dedicated people who would like to have gone. And also at the same time, and those of you involved with politics may remember a guy named John Bibby from Brookings. He was a Republican representative in Pierre. His son was drafted during Vietnam, went over there and was killed. Yet the guardsmen in Brookings were still walking on Main Street. Not a good situation. But again, thanks very much for your presentation. Well done.
More from the floor? Recollections?
Well, I grew up with Bob Daney, of course.
Yeah.
In fact, he's our best man. So I know a lot about Bob
There's a lot of Rodney stories.
and about his family.
Yeah. And his brother Bill.
Yeah, and then the twins wrestled for us, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, they're my age. Yeah.
And I remember when they weighed in, the coach would follow the one that weighed in first, would follow him around to be sure he didn't get back on the scale again. Oh, yeah.
Another National Guard trick. Yeah. The twins just needed to buy one ticket to the movie. That's how it worked. So, well, I thank you all for coming out here this morning and listening to Mr. Doering and me. It's fun to work on these things. As now as a retired guy, these recollections can kind of flood over me, and I could easily be here till 3:30 tomorrow afternoon, even without a beer, telling stories, and I'm sure lots of the rest of you that are in the room as well, to talk about what the National Guard was in Sturgis, and really what the National Guard has been in the Black Hills community, because it's prominent, or was prominent, Lee Deadwood, Spearfish, Belle Fourche, Rapid City, Custer, Hot Springs, Edgemont, then out onto the prairie and Phillip, Lemon, all of those kinds of communities, one way or another, have had either in the past have had National Guard units part of them, or today a unit of some flavor or another continues on in service to the state and the nation. So again, thank you. We don't have to drive home in the snow.
Yeah.